Sometimes, the things that try to stop us are the only things that truly see what's coming. The engine of Daniel Mercer's old pickup rumbled low against the frozen silence of the lake, a steady vibration beneath his hands as he stared out across the pale sheet of ice stretching nearly half a mile into the distance. The morning light barely breaking through a sky the color of cold steel, and for a moment he thought about just driving, not looking back, not thinking about the past that had followed him here like a shadow that refused to fade, because that had been the plan all along. Come up north, fix the place, sell it cheap, and disappear somewhere quieter, somewhere that didn't remember his name. But the second his foot eased onto the gas, something moved in front of the truck, fast, deliberate, alive, and he slammed the brake instinctively, the tires crunching against frost-hardened gravel as Shadow stood there, unmoving, directly in his path, his broad chest rising slowly, ears locked forward. Amber eyes fixed not on Daniel, but somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond, as if he were listening to something the world itself was trying to whisper. "Move, boy," Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice rough from disuse, but Shadow didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there like a barrier drawn in flesh and instinct, the same way he used to stand when something wasn't right, not barking, not panicking, just refusing. And that was what unsettled Daniel the most, because Shadow never made a mistake about things like this, not in the field, not in the years since, not ever. And yet this was nothing, just a quiet lakeside house sitting empty for decades, a place forgotten by everyone except the paperwork that had somehow ended up in his hands. A cheap property nobody wanted, half buried in snow and silence. And still the dog wouldn't let him leave. Daniel exhaled slowly, the fog of his breath curling against the windshield as he leaned back, watching, waiting, counting the seconds the way he used to when timing meant everything. 5, 10, 15. But Shadow didn't break. Instead, he took one slow step backward, then another, eyes never leaving that same invisible point, before turning slightly toward the house, just enough to make it clear, not a command, not force, but an invitation, or maybe a warning. And Daniel felt something shift inside him, something old, something trained into bone and memory, because this was familiar, this quiet insistence, this refusal to proceed without understanding. It was the same feeling he used to get before something surfaced, before the ground gave way, before the truth made itself known whether you were ready or not. "All right," he said finally, the word barely more than a breath, as he killed the engine and stepped out into the cold, boots pressing into the thin crust of snow that covered the ground in a fragile layer, the air biting sharp against his skin as Shadow moved ahead, not running, not urgent, just certain, leading him back toward the house they had already searched, already cleared, already dismissed as empty. And yet the closer they got, the more Daniel noticed things he hadn't before, the way the wind seemed to slip around the structure without touching it, the way the old wooden boards beneath the porch carried a faint, almost rhythmic creak, not random, not natural, something measured. And Shadow stopped at the doorway, head tilted slightly, listening again, really listening, before placing one paw against the wood and glancing back, just once, enough to say what he couldn't speak, and Daniel felt it then, deep and quiet, like a distant echo pressing through the walls of the world, something waiting, something patient, something that had almost let him walk away without ever knowing it was there. And for the first time since he arrived, Daniel didn't feel like he was leaving this place. He felt like something inside it had been waiting for him to stay. The door creaked open with a slow, deliberate sound, the kind that seemed to come not just from old hinges but from years of silence being disturbed. And the air inside the house met Daniel like a held breath finally released, cool and still with a faint scent of wood, dust, and something metallic that lingered just beneath the surface, not strong enough to name but impossible to ignore, while Shadow stepped across the threshold without hesitation, his nails tapping softly against the worn floorboards as his ears remained upright and focused, scanning a space that Daniel had already walked through the day before. A space he had believed to be empty, ordinary, forgettable, yet now it felt different, as if the house itself had shifted in his absence. Or perhaps it was simply that he was finally paying attention, truly paying attention, the way he had been trained to do when something did not sit right, when the silence carried weight, when instinct refused to be dismissed, You already checked this place, he murmured to himself, his voice low, almost uncertain, but Shadow did not respond in the way a dog usually would. No wagging tail, no glance back for reassurance, only a steady movement deeper into the house, past the narrow hallway and into the main room where pale light filtered through the frost-lined windows, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. And that was when Daniel heard it, faint at first, so faint it could have been mistaken for the settling of old wood or the distant shifting of ice on the lake. A soft, rhythmic sound that came and went with a precision that felt out of place in a structure this old, this forgotten, and he froze, his breath catching just slightly as his head tilted, listening, counting without realizing he was doing it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then silence, and then again. The same subtle vibration beneath his boots, not loud, not aggressive, but consistent, measured, almost deliberate, and something deep in his memory stirred, something he had not touched in years, the echo of nights spent waiting for signals beneath rubble, the faint patterns that meant life or danger depending on how you chose to read them. And Shadow stopped near the center of the room, lowering his head slowly until his nose hovered just above the floor, his body going completely still except for the slight movement of his chest, as if even his breathing had learned to quiet itself in the presence of whatever lay beneath. Then he tapped once, a single, firm press of his paw against the wood, followed by another, spaced evenly apart, not frantic, not random, but intentional, and Daniel felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the cold, because he recognized that pattern, not from training manuals or commands, but from experience, from moments when the difference between ignoring a signal and following it had meant everything. You hear that too, do not you? He said quietly, though the answer was already clear, and he stepped forward, crouching down as his hand pressed flat against the floor, the wood cool beneath his palm, worn smooth in places and rough in others. But beneath it, there it was again, that same faint pulse, steady, repeating, not the random shifting of a house settling into age, but something structured, something contained. And he closed his eyes for just a second, focusing not on what he thought it should be, but on what it was, letting the rhythm come to him, letting it speak in the only language it had. And when he opened his eyes again, they moved instinctively toward the far corner of the room, where the floorboards seemed just slightly different, the lines not perfectly aligned, the grain of the wood interrupted in a way that most people would never notice. But Daniel was not most people, not anymore, and Shadow had already moved there, sitting now, completely still, his gaze fixed on that exact spot as if guarding it, as if waiting, and for the first time since he had arrived at the lake, Daniel felt something shift inside him, not fear, not uncertainty, but a quiet understanding. That whatever this place had been hiding, it had not been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for someone who would stop, someone who would listen, someone who would not walk away when everything appeared empty. And slowly, carefully, he reached toward the edge of the board, fingers brushing along the seam as the faint vibration pulsed once more beneath his hand, steady as a heartbeat, patient as time itself. The edge of the floorboard resisted at first, as if it had forgotten how to move after so many years of stillness. But Daniel adjusted his grip and applied steady pressure, not forceful, not rushed, just enough to remind the wood that it was not sealed by time alone. And after a quiet second that seemed longer than it should have been, the board gave way with a muted shift, lifting just slightly along the seam as a thin line of darkness appeared beneath it, cold and absolute, like a space that had not seen light in decades. And Shadow leaned forward immediately, not barking, not rushing, just lowering his head closer to the opening, his ears angled forward with precise attention, as if the silence below carried more meaning than sound ever could, while Daniel slowly pulled the board aside, revealing a narrow rectangular gap no more than 12 inches wide, framed by rough timber and reinforced with something darker beneath, something metallic that caught the faint light from the window in a dull reflection. And that was when the air changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Daniel felt it, a subtle shift in temperature and pressure, like stepping into a place that held its own rhythm separate from the world above. And he paused, one hand resting on the exposed edge as he listened again, the pulse still there, faint but steady, rising from below in that same measured interval. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then silence. Then again. And his mind reached for explanations, old habits trying to assign logic to something that did not quite fit. Underground pipes, shifting frost, distant water movement beneath the lake. But none of it aligned with the precision of what he was hearing, because nature rarely moved in perfect intervals. And this was too exact, too intentional. Stay close, he said quietly, though Shadow had already positioned himself beside the opening, body angled protectively, as if whatever was below was not just a mystery, but something that required attention, respect, maybe even caution. And Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out a small flashlight, the metal casing worn smooth from years of use, clicking it on with a soft snap as a narrow beam of light cut through the darkness beneath the floor, revealing a shallow drop at first, maybe 3 feet down, just enough space for a hidden compartment or crawl space. But as he angled the light further, the beam stretched deeper than expected, revealing a narrow shaft reinforced with old wooden supports that descended at least another 6 or 7 feet before opening into something larger, something that could not be seen entirely from this angle. And the light flickered slightly as it hit the lower edge, not because of the battery, but because of movement, subtle, almost imperceptible, like air shifting where there should have been none. And Daniel felt his pulse slow, not quicken, the way it always did when focus replaced uncertainty, when instinct took over and guided his actions with quiet clarity. Because this was no longer about curiosity, it was about understanding what had been hidden here and why it had called him back. And he carefully widened the opening, sliding another board aside to give himself enough space to descend, the wood groaning softly but holding firm, as if it had been built to last, built to wait. And Shadow stepped closer, placing one paw on the edge before looking directly at Daniel. His gaze steady, unwavering, not fearful but certain, the same look he had carried in moments when the path forward was unclear but necessary. And Daniel nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, before lowering one leg into the opening, his boot finding the first support beam below, testing it with measured weight. And as he began to descend, the faint rhythmic pulse grew just a little stronger, not louder, but closer, like something that had been waiting in silence was finally being approached. And for the first time since he had lifted that board, Daniel understood that whatever lay beneath this house was not just hidden by chance. It had been placed there deliberately, left behind with purpose, and now, for reasons he could not yet explain, it had chosen to reveal itself. The beam beneath Daniel's boot held firm as he lowered himself further into the narrow shaft, his movements slow and deliberate, each shift of weight guided by instinct rather than haste. The flashlight clenched in his hand, casting a thin, steady glow that traced the rough wooden supports and the aged metal brackets bolted into the earth. And as his second foot found a lower brace, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air growing denser, cooler, carrying that same faint metallic scent, now stronger, more defined, as if the space below had been sealed away from time itself. And above him, Shadow remained at the opening for a brief moment, watching, calculating, before descending with a quiet precision that spoke of training and trust, his paws landing softly against the beams as he moved down beside Daniel, never rushing ahead but never hesitating either, always exactly where he needed to be. And when Daniel finally reached the bottom, his boots touched solid ground with a muted thud that seemed to echo just slightly longer than it should have, the sound stretching into the darkness beyond the reach of the light. And he straightened slowly, sweeping the beam across the space in front of him, revealing a narrow chamber carved beneath the house, roughly 8 feet wide and perhaps 15 feet long, the walls reinforced with old timber and sections of steel that had dulled with age, but still held their shape with quiet strength. And the floor beneath him was packed earth, firm and dry, undisturbed except for a faint line running along its center, almost like a seam where something had once been placed or moved. And then the pulse came again, closer now, clearer, not a vibration felt through wood or distance, but something that seemed to move through the air itself, a subtle pressure that brushed against his chest before fading, steady, patient, repeating with that same measured interval. And Daniel stilled completely, his breathing slowing as his mind reached back to patterns he had not used in years, not fear, not urgency, but recognition, Because this was not random. It was not the natural shifting of land or structure. It was intentional, structured, like a signal waiting to be understood rather than ignored. And Shadow moved forward then, just a few steps, his nose low, tracing that faint line along the ground before stopping near the far end of the chamber where the earth looked slightly darker, slightly more compacted, and he sat, not barking, not scratching, just sitting with a stillness that carried weight, his gaze fixed downward as if marking the exact point where something important rested beneath. And Daniel followed slowly, each step measured, the beam of light steady in his hand as it swept across the wall behind Shadow, revealing something he had not expected to see, a small metal panel set into the reinforced timber, about 2 feet wide and 1 foot high. Its surface worn but intact, edges lined with bolts that had not rusted through, and at its center, a simple handle. Not decorative, not hidden, just there, waiting, and Daniel crouched down beside it. The earth cooled beneath his knee as he studied the panel, his fingers brushing lightly against the metal, feeling the faint hum that pulsed through it in perfect rhythm with the unseen beat surrounding him. And that was when the realization settled quietly into place, not as a sudden shock, but as a steady understanding that grew with each passing second, because whatever had been built here was not an accident. It was not something abandoned or forgotten. It had been constructed with purpose, designed to endure, designed to remain silent until someone capable of listening found their way down. And Shadow leaned slightly closer, his shoulder brushing against Daniel's arm in a gesture that was neither warning nor reassurance, but something deeper, something shared. And Daniel took a slow breath, his hand closing around the handle as the pulse echoed once more through the chamber, steady as a heartbeat, patient as time itself, and he knew, without needing to say it aloud, that opening this would not just reveal what was hidden beneath the house, it would reveal why he had been stopped from leaving at all. Daniel did not pull the handle immediately, his hand resting there for a moment as if listening through his fingertips, feeling the faint, steady pulse that moved through the metal with quiet persistence. And something about it felt almost familiar, not in a way he could name, but in the way certain rhythms stayed with a person long after the moment had passed. And he glanced once toward Shadow, whose gaze had not shifted, whose posture remained grounded and certain, as if this was exactly where they were meant to be, not a step earlier, not a step later, but here, in this small chamber beneath a forgotten house where time seemed to move differently. And Daniel exhaled slowly before tightening his grip and pulling the handle upward, the motion firm but controlled, and for a brief second nothing happened, just the soft creak of old metal resisting the change. And then the panel gave way with a muted release, lifting just enough to break whatever seal had held it closed for so long. And a deeper current of air moved through the chamber, colder than before, carrying with it a faint, almost electric scent that made the back of his neck prickle, not in fear but in awareness, as if the space itself had just acknowledged their presence. And he shifted his position, using both hands now to slide the panel fully open, revealing a recessed compartment beneath, larger than he expected, nearly 4 feet deep and reinforced along its edges with the same careful construction that defined the rest of the hidden space. But it was not empty, not even close, because at the center of it sat a compact structure unlike anything he had seen in a place like this. A box, but not just a box, more like a sealed unit, about 2 feet long and 1 foot high, its surface smooth and metallic, untouched by rust or decay, as if time had simply passed around it rather than through it. And along its side ran a narrow strip that pulsed faintly with a soft, dim light, not bright enough to illuminate the chamber, but steady enough to be unmistakable, matching perfectly with the rhythm Daniel had been hearing since he stepped back into the house. And he leaned closer, the flashlight beam tracing the edges of the device, revealing no markings, no labels, nothing to explain its purpose or origin, just that quiet, unwavering signal that continued without interruption. And Shadow moved closer as well, lowering his head until his nose hovered inches above the surface. His ears still forward, but his body relaxed now, not tense, not alert in the way of danger, but calm, almost reverent, as if whatever this was did not threaten. It simply existed, waiting, and Daniel felt something shift again inside him, something deeper than curiosity, something that felt almost like recognition, Not of the object itself, but of the moment, because there had been times before, long ago, when he had stood at the edge of something unknown and had to decide whether to walk away or step forward, and each time had changed the course of everything that followed. And this felt no different, even if he could not yet understand why. And he reached out slowly, his hand hovering just above the surface of the device, feeling the faint warmth it gave off despite the cold surrounding air, the pulse steady beneath his palm even without contact. And for a brief moment he hesitated, not out of fear but out of respect for the unknown, because whatever had been hidden here had endured for years, maybe decades, untouched, undisturbed, waiting for a moment that had somehow found its way to him. And then, with a quiet breath, he lowered his hand onto the surface, the contact gentle but certain. And the response was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, as the soft pulse beneath his hand shifted ever so slightly, not in speed but in presence, like something acknowledging that it had finally been found. And Daniel did not pull away, did not speak. He simply stood there in the stillness of that hidden space, with Shadow beside him, both of them listening to a rhythm that no longer felt distant or unexplained, but connected, as if the line between what was hidden and what was understood had just begun to dissolve. The moment Daniel's hand settled against the surface, the faint light along the side of the device deepened just slightly, not brighter in intensity but richer in tone, like a signal shifting from distant to near, and the steady pulse that had filled the chamber began to change in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, stretching by a fraction of a second between each rhythm, as if something was adjusting, recalibrating, responding to his presence rather than simply existing on its own. And he remained still, his palm resting flat against the metal, feeling the warmth beneath it grow just enough to be noticeable, not hot, not uncomfortable, but alive in a way that no machine should have felt after being hidden this long. And Shadow let out a low, soft breath beside him, not a growl, not a warning, but something closer to recognition, his body easing further as he lowered himself to the ground, front legs stretched forward, head resting just inches from the edge of the compartment, eyes fixed on the device with a calm that spoke louder than any alarm ever could. And Daniel's gaze followed the faint strip of light along the side until he noticed something he had not seen before, a subtle seam running across the top of the unit, so precise it had been invisible until the light shifted. And as he leaned closer, the seam separated just slightly with a quiet, controlled motion, the top panel lifting no more than half an inch before pausing, as if waiting for confirmation, and Daniel instinctively removed his hand, not out of fear but to observe, to understand, and the device remained still for a second before the panel continued to rise slowly, revealing a narrow interior lined with a soft, dim glow that illuminated something resting inside, something small, carefully placed, and he leaned forward again, the flashlight no longer necessary as the light from within revealed a sealed envelope, its surface aged but preserved, edges clean, untouched by moisture or decay, and on its front, written in steady, deliberate handwriting, were two words that stopped him completely: "For you." And Daniel felt the air in his chest tighten just slightly, not in panic, but in the quiet weight of something deeply personal, something impossible to explain, because there was no name, no date, nothing to identify who had written it or when, just those two simple words placed with intention, as if whoever had left it here had known it would be found by the right person at the right time. And Shadow lifted his head slowly, watching as Daniel reached in, his fingers brushing against the envelope with a care that felt almost instinctive, as though he understood without being told that this was not just an object, it was a message. And as he lifted it free, the pulse from the device softened further, slowing until it became barely noticeable, like a heartbeat easing into rest after being heard at last. And Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling its weight, its texture, the faint impression of something folded inside. And for a moment he hesitated, not because he feared what it might contain, but because opening it would change something. It always did. And the silence in the chamber deepened around him, not empty but full, as if the space itself was waiting alongside him. And then, with a slow breath, he slid his finger beneath the sealed edge and carefully opened it, unfolding the paper inside. with steady hands, his eyes scanning the first line as the faint light from the device flickered once more, gentle and final, like a signal that had completed its purpose. And whatever he read in that moment did not shock him, did not overwhelm him. It settled into him quietly, deeply, in a way that felt less like discovery and more like remembering something he had always known but had forgotten along the way. And as he stood there beneath the house, with shadow beside him and the cold earth surrounding them, Daniel understood that the reason he had been stopped from leaving was never about the place itself. It was about what had been waiting for him within it, patient and silent, until he was ready to listen. Daniel did not realize how long he stood there reading until the cold began to settle deeper into his bones, not sharp or biting, but persistent, like the quiet passage of time reminding him that the world above still existed, even if this moment felt removed from it. And the paper in his hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from something else, something heavier, something that reached past thought and settled into the part of him he had kept closed for years, because the words written there were not instructions, not explanations, not even answers. They were something simpler and far more difficult to ignore, a message that spoke directly to the silence he had been carrying, as if whoever had written it had understood not just where he would be, but who he would become by the time he found it. And he read the lines again, slower this time, letting each word settle fully, not rushing, not searching for meaning, because the meaning was already there, clear in a way that did not demand interpretation. And beside him, shadow shifted slightly, rising from the ground and stepping closer, pressing his shoulder gently against Daniel's side, a steady presence that grounded him in the moment. And Daniel lowered the paper just enough to rest his hand against the dog's neck, fingers moving instinctively through the thick fur as he exhaled, long and quiet, the kind of breath that released something he had not realized he was still holding. And the chamber around them seemed different now, not in structure or sound, but in feeling, as if the tension that had once filled it had softened, replaced by a stillness that no longer felt uncertain. And Daniel folded the letter carefully, not creasing it more than necessary, just enough to hold it securely before slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to where his heart rested beneath layers of worn fabric and memory. And when he looked back toward the open compartment, the faint light within the device had dimmed further, the pulse now barely visible, as though whatever purpose it had served was complete, not broken, not failing, simply finished. And he reached down once more, not to activate it, not to search for more, but to close it, guiding the panel gently back into place until it settled with a quiet finality that echoed softly through the chamber. And for a moment he remained there, crouched in the dim light, listening, but the rhythmic pulse did not return, the silence now complete in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. And shadow turned toward the shaft above, glancing back once as if to confirm the next step, and Daniel nodded slightly, understanding without needing to speak, because whatever had been waiting here had given him exactly what it was meant to give, nothing more, nothing less. And as he stood and began to climb back up, his movements steady and unhurried, he noticed something subtle but undeniable, the weight he had carried. When he first arrived, the quiet heaviness that had followed him from place to place felt different now, not gone, but shifted, like a burden that had finally been acknowledged rather than avoided. And when his hands reached the edge of the opening, and he pulled himself back into the main room of the house, the pale light from the frozen lake spilling through the windows seemed brighter than before, softer somehow, and shadow leapt up beside him with ease, landing silently before turning in a slow circle and settling near the center of the room, his posture calm, his eyes no longer searching but at rest. And Daniel stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the house surrounding him, the letter warm against his chest, and he understood something now that he had not understood when he tried to leave, that sometimes the things we think we are ready to walk away from are the very things that are waiting to show us why we stayed in the first place. Daniel stepped out onto the small wooden porch, the boards beneath his boots giving a quiet, familiar creak as the cold morning air wrapped around him, sharper now, clearer somehow, as if the world itself had been waiting for him to return with something unseen but deeply changed. And the frozen lake stretched out before him like a sheet of pale glass, reflecting the sky in soft tones of gray and silver, while a light wind moved across its surface, carrying with it a faint whisper that barely touched the edges of sound. And he stood there for a long moment, not moving, not thinking in the way he used to, but simply feeling the stillness settle around him. The kind of stillness that did not demand anything in return. And behind him, Shadow stepped out quietly, his presence steady as ever, pausing at the doorway before walking forward to stand beside him, his gaze scanning the horizon once, then softening, as if whatever he had been listening for had finally fallen silent. And Daniel reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing against the folded letter resting close to his chest, and though he did not take it out again, he felt its weight there, subtle but certain, like a quiet reminder that some things did not need to be read twice to be understood. And his eyes drifted back to the house behind him, the weathered structure no longer appearing abandoned or empty, but grounded, purposeful in a way he had not noticed before, as if it had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal what it carried. And a memory surfaced then, not sharp or painful, but distant and steady, of a time when he had stood in another place, another silence, unsure of what came next, and how he had walked away from it without ever fully understanding what he had left behind. But this time felt different, not because the answers were clearer, but because he had not turned away when it would have been easier to do so. And Shadow shifted slightly, sitting down beside him, his tail resting against the wooden boards, his posture relaxed, no longer alert or searching, just present. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air as it drifted away. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet inside him matched the quiet around him, not empty, not hollow, but complete in a way that did not need to be filled. And he glanced down at Shadow, his hand moving instinctively to rest against the dog's head, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur as he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not a command, not a signal, just an acknowledgement of something shared between them that did not require words. And as the wind moved lightly across the lake once more, Daniel turned his gaze toward the road he had nearly taken earlier, the path that had seemed so certain just hours before, and now felt distant, unnecessary, like something that belonged to a version of him that no longer quite existed. And he understood then, in a quiet and steady way, that leaving had never been the real choice, not in the way he had thought, because sometimes the moments that stop us are not obstacles at all. They are invitations, waiting patiently until we are willing to see them for what they are. And as the light over the lake shifted just slightly, breaking through the thin cover of clouds, Daniel did not move toward the truck, did not reach for the keys. He simply stood there, grounded in a place that no longer felt temporary, no longer felt like something to pass through. And Shadow remained at his side, calm and certain, as if the path ahead did not need to be rushed, because whatever came next would not be something to escape from, but something to step into, one quiet moment at a time. The day moved forward without asking anything from him, the light slowly shifting across the frozen lake as the pale gray sky softened into a quieter shade of blue. And Daniel remained on the porch longer than he intended, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to rush towards something else. And the silence that once felt heavy now carried a kind of clarity, a space where thoughts did not crowd or demand answers. They simply existed and then passed, like the wind brushing across the surface of the ice. And eventually he stepped back inside, the familiar creak of the floor greeting him again. But it sounded different now, less like something worn down by time and more like something steady, grounded. And he moved through the house slowly, not searching, not inspecting, just noticing, the way the light settled along the walls, the way the air held a quiet warmth despite the cold outside, the way each room felt connected in a way he had overlooked before. And Shadow followed close behind, his steps relaxed, his attention no longer fixed on hidden signals or unseen patterns, but on Daniel himself, as if the need to guide had given way to something simpler, something like companionship without urgency. And when Daniel reached the center of the room where the floor had been opened, he paused, looking down at the place where the boards now rested seamlessly again, no sign of what lay beneath except for the memory of it. And he placed his hand lightly against the wood, not expecting to feel anything. And he did not. No pulse, no vibration, just the solid quiet of a space that had already given what it needed to give. And that felt right. not like something lost, but something completed, and he straightened slowly, his hand drifting once more to the inside of his jacket, feeling the letter still there, unchanged, steady. And he understood that whatever it had said would not fade with time. It would remain the same, even as he changed around it. And that thought settled into him with a quiet certainty, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just present. And later, as the sun dipped lower and the light across the lake turned soft and golden, Daniel stepped outside again, this time without hesitation, without the sense that he was leaving something behind, and Shadow walked beside him, matching his pace exactly, neither leading nor following, just there, and together they moved a short distance down toward the edge of the frozen shoreline, where the ice met the land in a thin, uneven line, and Daniel stopped there, looking out across the wide, open expanse. And for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the cold air fill his lungs, letting the quiet surround him completely. And when he opened them again, there was no urgency waiting for him, no pressure to decide what came next, only the understanding that whatever path he chose would not be shaped by what he was trying to escape, but by what he had finally chosen to face. And he turned back toward the house, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had arrived, truly arrived. And as the last light of the day settled gently over the landscape, Daniel and Shadow walked back together, their footsteps soft against the ground, leaving behind no rush, no noise, only the quiet trace of a moment that had changed something unseen, something that did not need to be spoken to be real. And in that stillness, the world did not feel empty anymore. It felt patient, as if it had always known that some journeys are not about finding something new, but about finally understanding what was waiting all along.